Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, you all. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for the introductory remarks. Well, I took notes on some aspects that were mentioned by David in his first presentation. Well, the idea of having this session particularly was exactly in the way, as I stressed, to share with you my experience when I was in the Central Bank of Brazil dealing with IFRS implementation in our country. I spent 20 years in the regulatory department within the Central Bank. My major is accounting, so I was a former auditor when I joined the Central Bank. And I started, just for you to have an idea of this 20 years experience in the Central Bank, when I started as a junior advisor in the accounting regulation division, we were dealing with 3,000% a year hyperinflationary scenario. When I left the Central Bank, we were dealing with 4.5% a year inflationary scenario. So it was a very interesting period to learn, and of course I do not wish this for anyone. But anyway, in dealing with an economy that was basically very difficult to manage, we had to, during this process, move to a better system, let's say, to allow the central bank to properly supervise and monitor the financial institutions. So I would like to make some remarks before we go into. I know among you there are a number of security supervisors as well and insurance supervisors. This presentation is mostly focused on the banking sector. However, as I can share with you the experience in the insurance side and the security side as well. Because in the whole process, we established in Brazil a committee that was composed by the security supervisor, the insurance supervisor, and the banking supervisor to deal and discuss aspects of regulation in general, and not only accounting regulation. The second point that I would like to make before going on is that in Brazil there is no separate supervisor for the banking sector. So the central bank still holds the basic central bank functions on the monetary policy side, but also the supervision. We discussed the possibility of splitting the supervision regulation from the traditional central banking activities back in the 90s, basically influenced by the trend experience in the world at that time with the creation of the FSA in the UK, and many countries, developed countries particularly, creating their own financial supervisory agencies as well in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. But at the end of the day, we decided not to do so. Why? Basically because one of the main issues was that we understood at that time that the potential lack of information sharing could be a problem in dealing with crisis. And this was, in our case, very much confirmed as the appropriate decision during the 2008-07 crisis, because then we could really get together very easily and sharing all the information necessary to deal with aspects of the crisis. The third point, before going into the points, is that I will share with you the process that we took in adopting IFRS, implementing IFRS in the financial sector. But it was key for us in the central bank at some point. It's a high-level decision in a country. In Europe, within the European Union, it's a little bit distinct. I understand that. The decision can be taken into the European at the European level. But in the case of Brazil, when we proposed it to the board, the adoption of IFRS, the decision was actually quite surprising to me at the time that I was leading the project, was that the governor of the central bank required us to, before requiring financial institutions to adopt IFRS, the central bank should do it first. So 5 years before any financial institution was required to prepare financial statements and publish audited financial statement prepared in accordance with IFRS, the central bank itself did its own set of financial statements audited as well, adopting IFRS. Of course, we do not have IFRS for public entities like a central bank. And the central banks are unique, of course. We have one in each country mostly. So, but the central bank established a team and hired a consultants firm to help us integrate or in a way interpret the IFRS that were developed for private entities, listed entities, to be adopted by the central bank. So the central bank in 2006 published its first set of IFRS financial statements audited by an independent auditor, and the financial institutions were required only from 2010, so 5 years on. So it was surprising to me and very important. So the example coming from the central bank. And last point, Martin mentioned about staffing. The ladies who comment on Poland's experience on staffing, we are not alone. So almost everywhere, the main issue with IFRS and in the supervisor teams is generally staffing. We not only lack, well, I cannot say we because I'm not supervisor anymore. I still have this, I'm with the IASB, but generally there are two aspects in the staffing. Firstly, the lack of people. We do not have generally enough people to perform all the tasks associated with supervision, including regulation. And second aspect is skilled staffing as well, because there are aspects in working with for the government that the private sector can easily overcome and hiring the best ones. So it's not uncommon in this part of the world. In Latin America, mostly my experience in Latin America is very much the same case. Every country that is adopting IFRS now, and I'm discussing with supervisors in countries like Colombia and Peru, even Brazil that has adopted for a number of years. The main aspect, it's not only the application of IFRS in particular, but the lack of skilled staff. So basically in the next 40 minutes, 35 to 40 minutes, two main aspects. So firstly, an overview of implementing IFRS in the Brazilian financial sector. So there are some whys that I think it's important, because we were not required by anyone to use IFRS. So it was a decision taken internally by the government. How we adopted, how was the process of IFRS adoption in Brazil, and the main issues we discussed in the process of adoption. And some of those issues still remain, are still from time to time discussed within my colleagues in the central bank. I still have permanent contact with them. And after the implementation, which were the main aspects or the main points? Firstly, let me talk a little bit about implementing IFRS in the Brazilian financial sector. Most of these aspects do apply for the insurance side and the listed companies as well. I divided those aspects in two groups, macroeconomic and microeconomic aspects. First, in the macroeconomic side, one is very, very common. It's the integration of financial markets. Actually, the first point It's in a global market, our national gap really won't work, especially because we felt that Brazil needed the acknowledgement of the international participants that we had an appropriate business environment for investors in general to come and do business in Brazil. And this could be very much facilitated if we use the same set of financial reporting standards that were being used in most countries. Even during the inflationary period, there were some Brazilian companies that were issuing bonds and securities abroad. Mostly depository receipts in the New York Stock Exchange. We have at this moment 27 of the largest Brazilian companies that are listed in New York. And they are not listed recently. Some of them have been listed for 15 years or so, 20 years or so. And of course, we didn't have at the time IFRS, so they used US GAAP. And for the ones who were issuing bonds or other types of securities in the European market, in the Asian markets, they were using a different set of accounting standards, generally US GAAP, and from 2005 they started using IFRS voluntarily, only for the issuance. So we understood that we were imposing a significant burden on Brazilian companies that were looking to do business abroad. And of course, with the opening of the economy, with a more stable economy, we had a case for using a better system for accounting. And we had in this process what I called an opportunity window. Then, so it started with the economic stability. I was in the central bank back in 1994 when we had what we understood at the time our last shot in trying to kill the hyperinflation. And so from one day to the other, we implemented another economic plan after 5 or 6 that we had since the 70s, and most of them in the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s. So, and one of the discussions was, okay, but if it works, what should we do to have a better system as a whole? And one of the issues that we had to take advantage of the opportunity window that will potentially open to us with a more stable economy and more stable political environment as well. So it's not it's not a significant period. It's still 19 years. Next year we will hopefully commemorate 20 years of economic stability in Brazil. And we understood that was an opportunity window that we could not afford to lose again. And we need resources for long-term investments for many reasons. A country with such a high inflationary environment is very difficult for anyone to take decisions on investments. And actually in the 2000s this was even more important. After a couple of years of stability, coupled with the political stability as well, the changing from the right, I would say the right wing to a leftist government didn't actually affect the economy or the perception of stability in the country. So it really helped us in shaping a new image of Brazil abroad. And we have, as many countries, as most countries in Latin America, we have a problem or a challenge with a very low level of domestic savings. The domestic savings in Brazil represents roughly 17 to 16% of GDP, compared to countries that are generally similar to Brazil, such as China or India, the domestic savings can reach easily more than 45% of GDP. So we basically don't have enough savings generated internally to promote or to promote investments, particularly the long-term investments. So we have a natural demand for external resources, particularly from investors, and because the country is expected to experience a long-term period of economic expansion, there is an appetite from investors as well to seek for opportunities in Brazil. So if we have a look in the report on foreign direct investments that is published by UNCTAD every year, Latin America has experienced a constant growth in attracting investments from abroad for the last 6 or 10 years. And Brazil is among those countries is the one that is receiving the larger portion. It's sometimes 78% of the investments in Latin America is directed to Brazil. And if you go and explore a little bit further, most of those investments are in the infrastructure sector. Energy, airports, ports, roads are the ones that attract lots of investors. So in the macroeconomic aspects, we had all the potential benefits and the need for a better information structure. In microeconomic terms, that was mostly under this, let's say, the supervisory aspect of why adopting IFRS. We started very early with international banks, particularly European banks, coming to the central bank and asking the central bank to adopt IFRS. So actually we started back in the 90s with the banks that used US GAAPs, the North American banks and the Brazilian banks that were listed in New York, coming to the central bank and asking the central bank to allow the adoption, the use of US GAAP. First, why not US GAAP? Because when we were discussing the potential, the perspective of adopting US GAAP, the one aspect that we discussed was clearly the possibility for the Central Bank of Brazil or Brazilians in general to influence the development of US GAAP. And we had no possibility to actually influence in any way the development of US GAAP or the enhancement of US GAAP to take into consideration Brazilian expectations or Brazilian wishes or desires with regards to an accounting standard in particular. So we simply crossed it out because we understood it was very much devoted to US market and it might not always serve the Brazilian interest in this aspect. The second was IFRS. So the European banks that were operating in Brazil, because from 2005 they had to report in IFRS, so they had, of course, the Brazilian GAAP, and they have to translate this into IFRS to consolidate in Europe. They came naturally to the central bank and said, well, why don't you use IFRS, because we are already doing this. So this was not in 2005, it started back in the beginning of 2000s. And I will show you in a few minutes how we did it. And so, but we decided that point that was not appropriate to adopt IFRS, or not at that moment. So the European banks still had to prepare the financial reporting in Brazilian GAAP and do whatever necessary to consolidate in Europe. But we believed that it would be important that at some point we adopt IFRS. because there were potential benefits for supervisor purpose. One was the comparability between Brazilian entities and entities that were using IFRS especially for published financial reporting. The second was the IFRS potentially would provide more transparent information and better quality information. And because of Basel II had a particular interest in fostering market discipline, we believe that IFRS could help us in fostering market discipline in a market that was still with lots of potential to grow. The third point was the potential technical enhancement. So we knew that if we kept Brazilian GAAP, in a number of years we would be out of date compared to other professionals, other supervisors. And also here, the real possibility for the central bank to influence the development of IFRS. The aspects associated with operational costs, we had already this experience with the European banks. The European banks share the experience in terms of operational costs. So we learned with them how much they were devoting in terms of time, structure, and people in not only preparing the Brazilian GAAP, but also converting Brazilian GAAP to IFRS and then sending this information in IFRS to their headquarters for consolidation. So we learned that the operational costs, at least the costs associated with preparing two sets of information they were significant. And the cost of capital. At the time we started seeking for information on cost of capital, and some banks, Brazilian banks, they asserted that they had significant reductions in cost of capital when preparing financial reporting in IFRS. And one of the last bullet point, the financial stability. We were already seeking to reinforce the stability that we achieved with the macroeconomic policies, and because the lack of good quality information really influenced the perception of financial stability, and we had this experience. We discussed it frequently, for instance, with rating agencies that from time to time come to Brazil and ask about the information that we had and the environment that we had, and then we perceive that high quality information, the good quality information provided by the adoption of IFRS could really promote the financial stability, in the sense that the regular flow of resources to Brazil could be kept with the help. This is not the most important, but this is one of the key aspects when assessing financial stability. So how we conducted this process? First, we had to have a very good coordination, internal coordination, external coordination. In the central bank, basically, we had the regulator, the regulatory side, the supervisory side. There are two distinct areas in the central bank. And we also had the economics department, so with lots of statistics about the history of the Brazilian financial system, and they wish to keep it. So we had to coordinate not only the process of regulation, but also how would the supervision and other areas in the central bank would use this information. And we had to coordinate externally. One of the key partners, of course, was the Securities Commission. A little bit with standard setters, we had to do that. Why? Because legally the central bank has the power to impose accounting and auditing regulation. This is the case in Brazil. In other countries, this is the case as well. So we had to coordinate with them, basically trying to influence their structuring in order to have a more skilled people dealing with standard setting. Sometimes the standard setting, because those regulatory agencies, they have the power, they are not composed with the best and more skilled professionals. And we spend a lot of time in dealing with the tax authority, particularly when talking about fair value measurement and the effect and the potential effects in tax associated with gains, not losses. The losses, they were happy with the loss, but they were mostly seeking the gains. So we had to coordinate very well with them in order not to have any effect associated with changes in IFRS. We performed a diagnosis of our Brazilian GAAP compared to IFRS. This diagnosis is still available in the case of Brazil in the Central Bank website, although in Portuguese, but it's there. So we analyzed each existing IFRS, compared it with the national GAAP, and identified the most important aspects if moved from national GAAP to IFRS. And identifying the challenges and how to reduce what we call asymmetries, because we were focusing on consolidated financial reporting. So because the law requires the banks to prepare individual or separate financial reporting, the aim was to reduce asymmetries as much as possible. And the transitional period was to assess the major impacts and how to overcome those impacts, particularly in terms of, in the regulatory side, covenants and regulatory capital. How would we treat the capital requirement for particular items? One that was very important in Brazil was deferred tax assets. How would we treat and the effect this had in equity? We discussed quite a lot if we should have a big bang, what we call the big bang, or one day that all IFRS would be implemented, or if we should have a gradual implementation. Actually, without really knowing what we're doing, we were already in a gradual implementation, and I will tell you why shortly. Well, so we implemented gradually some IFRSs, and then we established a date for the big bang, but only for consolidated financial reporting. In the educational side, we had to build capacity, not only internally but also externally. Internally, what the central bank did was within it's a case in Brazil, the central bank has a permanent postgraduate program. So we had established a level, it was 2 to 3% of all central bank employees are permanently for the last 30 years doing masters or PhDs in Brazil or abroad in issues associated with the central bank activities. So when we started the process in the end of the 90s of discussing IFRS implementation, just as an example, we had in our accounting regulation team, we had 4 people. I was one of them. So, and I was then sent to the UK to do a master's in accounting and financing, focusing on IFRS. So after that, in 10 years, we reinforced this area with 12 people, all of them with masters or PhD abroad or in Brazil, all focused on IFRS. And the supervisory team did the same. They sent a number of people abroad, mostly to Europe, or studying in Brazil. And also we developed together with leading universities in Brazil specific training for supervisors. So training that are in the level of masters, in-house, developed for supervisors. We generally had a team like this, 60 people or so, and those supervisors were responsible for sharing this information in internal training for smaller groups during a number of years, before IFRS adoption. So we started that in the 90s, and we are still doing this, because every day, almost every day, we have new supervisors coming in. And also we had a particular concern about the external education aspects of building capacity, particularly within the auditing profession. That was, of course, the external auditor's responsibility. So we still have some aspects in Brazil that's not very common. So we have auditors rotation in Brazil. This was implemented in the 90s. I think it's the only country that still has. I was responsible to leading this project in the 90s. At the time, we had Italy with a 12 years auditors rotation, and we had the experience of Spain in the 90s. So why we imposed the auditors rotation? Because of some significant bankruptcies in Brazil, so we implemented that. And within this framework for auditors rotation, we required auditors to be assessed from time to time with a permanent educational exam that is run by and organized by the profession. So the capacity building is very important. And in terms of operational, particularly systems and process, the need for the supervision to develop new tools for monitoring, and also the systems to receive and process information prepared in accordance with IFRS, particularly for other areas within the central bank that use these information. So the main issues discussed during this process was, the first one I mentioned already, IFRS or US GAAP, no way to adopt US GAAP, no way to influence. The costs and benefits associated with that, we understood that the costs were lower than the benefits that we would achieve in the long run. It's not something that we really assess, consider 2 or 3 years, but we should consider 20 years or so. The need for an adequate transition, I also comment a little bit. What I didn't comment was the decision to adopt and do not adapt any IFRS. So the IFRS in Brazil are adopted in the way they are approved by the IASB, and we had no level of adaptation for, again, the consolidated financial reporting, and I would talk about it. Another point that was discussed very much, particularly between the supervisors, was the characteristics of having the IFRS being developed in a principles-based and not rules-based, being a country with a Roman code of law, so very much detailed what you can do, what you cannot do. The judiciary system very much entrenched with this notion of you are authorized to do this or that. So a new system developed based basically on principles would be challenging for the supervision, and particularly when it comes to consistent application. Because if it's a matter of judgment, I might have this, it's not expected, but I might have the same economic occurrence being assessed differently by one institution and another institution. It's not expected, but this can occur dealing due to the level of information associated. And one aspect that is very much important, it's not always perceived or discussed or considered in some jurisdictions, is the need for maintenance. So the IASB is constantly updating or enhancing the IFRS literature. and also developing new IFRS literature. So it's very challenging to keep updated on this. Recently, we were running a similar seminar as this one in Latin America, and we had about 50 people, most of them from countries that already adopted IFRS. And when we asked about IFRS 10, for instance, the consolidation requirement that is effective from 1st of January 2013, none of them had adopted. So suddenly they were not IFRS compliant anymore. And then I asked, why didn't you adopt? Oh, it's too much for us. We didn't really updated our regulation. In some countries they need a law. Some countries they need a specific piece of regulation approved by the Minister of Finance. And the Minister of Finance has other priorities. And so, and that's it. For instance, in Brazil, to implement a piece of regulation at this level, it needs to be approved by what we call National Monetary Council. National Monetary Council is composed by the Governor of the Central Bank, the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Planning and Budget. So they are generally economists or macroeconomists with other priorities in mind. So to have their attention to approve a piece of accounting regulation, it's not always an easy process. You have to go through a long process and explaining to their advisors what's going on, what's happening, and what would be the potential effects, particularly in capital requirement and the appetite of financial institutions to continue to keep providing loans in an economy. So, but what roughly the process started in Brazil actually in 1996. It was not. That's why I mentioned that we, without really knowing, we started gradually to implement IFRS. Why? Because in the middle of the 90s, soon after the stabilization process, one of the decisions taken by the government was to cease operations of state banks. Not federal government, but state banks. Every state in Brazil had its own bank, and the banks were not profitable, but they had one asset that was quite valuable, was the deferred tax asset. So, and we didn't have the deferred tax asset in our literature, in our national GAAP. The only literature with deferred tax asset was the FASB literature and the IAS literature. So we implemented the deferred tax asset as an asset. We allowed institutions to actually, it's a little bit distinct. We allowed, not required them to account for the deferred tax asset. And almost all state banks accounted for, so they had a huge asset and they could be sold quite easily. In 2002, we implemented IAS 39, that or parts of IAS 39. So we basically implemented the classification in 3 categories, the fair value requirement, hedge accounting, but we didn't allow fair value option or macro hedge. So it was portions of, and we also implemented the portion on the recognition. So we started picking some aspects of IAS or IAS literature that were perceived as important for us, but without really deciding clearly that we were doing a gradual implementation. This was decided in 2006. So in between 96 and 2002, the governor decided for the central bank to adopt IFRS, and in 2006, after the central bank published its first financial statements in IFRS, the central bank formalized its decision to require IFRS for consolidated financial reporting in 2010. In between, out of the central bank, and this applies for the securities side, we had a bill of law in 2000 sent to the Congress, and Congress, as you know, sometimes take a long time to decide upon a proposal. And this basically, the Bill of Law required the use of, we cannot have in our law any word that's not in Portuguese. So we couldn't say in the law IFRS as in Portuguese, as approved by the IASB. So we use the words something like internationally adopted accounting standards. In 2005, it was created the standard setter, trying to congregate all stakeholders interested in accounting standards in Brazil. So it's not only, because the public sector, the government entities cannot be part of a private organization easily, so you have to go through a very long process to have an approval. We are observers, so the Central Bank, Securities Commission, Insurance Supervisor, and the tax authorities are observers in this committee, and the committee is basically formed by members of the committee. The committees are of the committee are the profession, the academics, listed companies association, stock exchange. There are two others that I always forget, but anyway, it's now they are the standard setters. They have a very clear objective of translating IFRS into Portuguese and submitting to approval. So that Bill of Law that was sent to the Congress in 2000 was finally approved in 2007. And the very last day of 2007, it was published in our official Gazette in the 31st of December 2007. Surprisingly, because it was approved in such a day, it was required to be implemented in 1st of January 2008. No one even know that they were approved, but anyway, so we had to overcome some difficulties in order to have the first time adoption in 2007. So summarizing what we have nowadays from 2010, that's why it publishes in caps lock. Financial institutions in Brazil publish consolidated financial statements from 2010 if first they are listed companies, financial institutions, or they have required capital above $308 million. I don't know in euros how much it would be, but 1 billion Brazilian reais. This mostly covers, these two conditions covers almost 95% of the financial sector. So financial sector in Brazil, they have roughly, well, last time I saw it was about 2,200 financial institutions under supervision of the Central Bank. Significant portion are cooperatives, credit cooperatives, so they are very small ones. But with these two conditions, almost roughly 90% of the financial sector in terms of assets and liabilities are prepared in accordance with IFRS. But they kept Brazilian GAAP for supervisory purpose. Firstly, because they are required, all Brazilian companies are required by law to prepare separate financial statements. So they kept Brazilian GAAP for separate. And for the supervisory purpose, they have two types of consolidates. One is called operational and the other one is called economic consolidation. That goes well beyond what IFRS requires in terms of consolidation, and it's used only for supervisory purpose and capital requirement calculation. And there are some asymmetries identified, and that the Central Bank has said they would eliminate as soon as possible. One is loan loss provisioning. Although they say they will eliminate, I personally don't foresee elimination of loan loss provisioning from supervisory environments where they are more strict than the IASB. In the case of Brazil, they are day one loan loss provisioning for separate accounts. For consolidated accounts, they will follow always IFRS. Fair value option for liabilities, until this very moment, it's not allowed for separate financial reporting. Finance leasing. In Brazil, there is a specific law that deals with lease, so there is no to make any change in the leasing and followed IFRS. They have to change first the law that deals with leasing operation. So to be eliminated, they'll have to change. Equity method for investments, it is required by law in Brazil when preparing separate individual financial reporting. In the IASB, it's not allowed, although in the last month, the IASB approved a specific project to discuss the return of the equity method for the separate financial reporting. PPE revaluation is prohibited in Brazil by law. Why? Because during the hyperinflationary period, the experience was that many companies used the revaluation as a means to enhance the balance, the financial reporting, and lots of questions around the revaluation process as well. So the law simply prohibits revaluation. Goodwill, it's still amortized in Brazil, and also impairment for the separate financial reporting is still basically use the tax requirement or allowance for impairment. Other decisions taken with regards to IFRS. Early application is not allowed. There is a particular decision taken by the ministries that although the IASB can decide that for early application, as of today, early application is not allowed, will not be allowed. Well, the reduction of symmetries and the need to change the law for some aspects I've already mentioned briefly. Main effects so far when adopted after or during as a result of adoption of IFRS. Disclosure, much more detailed disclosure, not only in terms of the level of detail, but the amount of disclosure as well. The leasing requirement in IAS 17, particularly to the finance leasing in the consolidated financial reporting, is totally different from the individual one. In the individual one, I would say that it's quite similar to our proposal actually in the IASB nowadays. So the leased asset still is kept as a PPE by the lessor in the Brazilian model. In the finance leasing under IAS 17, you have to write off the leased asset. Stock options, it's not included as a requirement in the separate financial reporting. When doing business combinations for the separate, the business combination requirement for fair value of assets and liabilities, it's not adopted for separate financial reporting as well. Segment reporting, much more detailed disclosure on the consolidation, when preparing consolidation, publishing consolidation. And the requirement for employee benefits expenses contained in IAS 19. It was already required for listed companies. For the ones that are non-listed, it's not yet required, only if they prepare, of course, consolidated. So those were the main aspects. I would be happy to take questions, if not now during the coffee break. But one very last thing that you mentioned during the presentation by Grunberger, yes, was the complexity and judgment that I took note here. Those are frequently discussed within supervisors in Latin America, not only in Brazil, about the level of complexity in IFRS and judgments, particularly when it comes to fair value measurement. In most markets in Latin America, they don't have an active market for the majority of bonds, securities, and other types of assets. So they would fall on level 3 valuation measure, and some of them are not really comfortable about the models used by entities. But once I was discussing this with the governor of the central bank, who was a very successful asset manager, I told him, look, some banks came to us asking for the central bank to impose a particular model for valuation. And he asked me, so why they require this? Well, because they believe if we impose a particular model for valuation, they will have more comparability among their peers, and they won't have any difficulty in valuing their assets. And he replied, well, I'm very much concerned with this, because if those banks do not know how to value the asset that they are buying, they should be under scrutiny from our supervisory team, because if they don't know how to buy those assets, how to transact with those assets. So that's for me was key in understanding the valuation process for entities under supervision. If they are not able to value an asset, they shouldn't be allowed to transact with that asset in particular and be under severe scrutiny by the supervisory entity. So thank you very much. I'm open to questions now or later on. Thank you.